Welcome to this online lecture. Today we are going to continue our discussion of totalitarianism by studying one specific example of the totalitarian state that arose in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and the 1930s. So, let's get to it. We have already discussed a definition of totalitarianism. We also talked about why totalitarianism really isn't possible in the 1920s or the 1930s. One was the example of World War I. During World War I, the practice of total war was developed. This was the idea that said that every resource, every citizen of a nation should go towards winning the war. This expands the power of government greatly. And once governmental power expands, it's very, very hard to get it to go back to the way it was before the war. A second thing that's going to make totalitarianism possible is the sense of emergency or crisis. World War I, again, is a good example of this. People were willing to accept total war because they saw the crisis of winning that war as so critical, so important, that they were willing to give up their freedoms. They were willing to give additional power to the government. And so this sense of emergency or crisis is also going to be important in justifying the creation of a totalitarian state. And of course, the 1920s and the 1930s, as we have seen, are basically very fertile ground for the creation of emergencies and crises. The third thing that goes into creating a totalitarian state is propaganda. And again, propaganda is the mass manipulation of popular opinion through media. Propaganda is invented in World War I, and governments find that they can continue to use it even after the war is over. Moreover, with the beginning of radio and film, it's going to become even easier for propaganda to be disseminated into every home in the land. Leaders will become more than names on a page or paintings. They will become real voices and real faces that people will learn to trust and follow. Keep these three things in mind as we discuss the Soviet example. Before we can get into the creation of the totalitarian Soviet state, however, we need to talk a little bit about the history of the Soviet Union. The history of the Soviet Union begins in 1917 with the overthrow of the Tsar's government. But it's not the communists who overthrow the Tsar. It is in fact a group of liberals led by a fellow named Alexander Kerensky who lead this first Russian Revolution. However, Kerensky is not able to create a stable government, and in late 1917, the Bolsheviks, or the communists, under Vladimir Lenin, will overthrow his government and begin the creation of the first communist state. But this is not an easy process. Once Lenin and the communists seize power, they are immediately challenged by conservatives within Russian society. And from 1917 until 1921, a civil war will rage across Russia. And again, this brutal civil war is being fought between the communists under Lenin and the conservatives who hoped to restore a conservative monarchy to Russia. In 1921, the communists will emerge victorious. They will declare Russia to be the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union for short. This will make Russia, or the Soviet Union, the world's first communist nation. But it's important to understand where Lenin was in our, in our hierarchy of isms. Lenin, just to make sure you understand this, was no liberal. He did not believe in democracy. He had no respect for human rights, nor was he willing to share power with other political groups, with other political parties. All of these things are hallmarks of what a liberal believes, and Lenin believed in none of those things. Instead, Lenin quickly went about creating a communist dictatorship with himself at the top. Lenin isn't able to enjoy the fruits of power for very long, however. He will die in 1924, and this is going to create a crisis in Russia. Lenin left no orders for who was to replace him, so therefore a power struggle will erupt between two men, Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky. Both had very different ideas on how the revolution should be carried out. Ultimately, Stalin will win this struggle. That's not too bad for a guy who was born the son of a cobbler. As a young man, Stalin studied to be a priest at a seminary, but he was expelled for his revolutionary work. He will join Lenin's party in 1903 and quickly rise through the ranks to become one of Lenin's most powerful advisors. By 1927, Stalin and his forces will have defeated Trotsky and his supporters. Stalin will now become the most powerful man in the Soviet Union. Ultimately, Trotsky will be forced to flee Russia, and he will take up residency in Mexico. But even there, he's not safe. Stalin's men will find him in 1940 and murder him. So what was the Soviet Union like under Joseph Stalin? Well, after he becomes the most powerful man in the Soviet Union, Stalin will begin addressing some of the country's greatest problems. At the forefront of those problems is industrialization, or to be more specific, the lack of industrialization in Russia. World War I had destroyed what little industry Russia had. The Civil War took care of anything that survived World War I, and so Stalin is working to rebuild the economy. Thus, he is going to do this by the creation of what he calls the 5-year plan. The 5-year plan involves goals for every area of Soviet industry that they must meet. For example, the 5-year plan will include how many tractors should be constructed every year between 1929 and 1933. It's going to tell Soviet farmers how many millions or billions of bushels of wheat should be harvested between that period of time. This is true communism. The Soviet government is setting those goals without regard to the market. Another part of the 5-year plans is going to be something called collectivization. Essentially, what Stalin declares is that if communism is going to be the law of the land in the Soviet Union, there could be no private property. And so therefore, all of the farmers out there are asked to give up their land, to give that land to the Soviet government. No surprise, most of those farmers will resist this effort to collectivize Soviet agriculture. In other words, to bring Soviet agriculture under the control of the government. Most of the peasants and the farmers who produce the Soviet Union's food don't want to give up their land. They like their private property. Stalin's reaction will be to send in his troops. Millions of peasants who resist collectivization will be killed. Not everyone was thrilled with collectivization or with what the army had to do. As this gentleman remarked, "I fought in the Civil War. Did I do all that in an order that I should now surround villages with machine guns and order my men to fire indiscriminately into crowds of peasants? Oh no." End quote. In other words, this is a pretty good description of what was going on in collectivization. It was a brutal policy. It was a policy that ultimately is going to lead to the deaths, as I said, of millions of people. How many people? Possibly 5 million dead peasants will be the result of Stalin's collectivization plans. But how does the Soviet Union go from being simply a communist state to a totalitarian state? That's what we need to examine in the last few slides here. One key element you need to understand is something known as the cult of personality. This is really going to be at the heart of the development of the Soviet totalitarian state. Now first we need to understand what a cult of personality is. A cult of personality creates an almost religious devotion to a central governmental figure. In the Soviet Union, that figure is going to become Joseph Stalin. Posters of Stalin will be placed all over the Soviet Union. Many of these posters, as well as the statues and the paintings, are enormous, and they will lead you to believe that Stalin is looking out for you, or at least that Stalin is watching over you. A true cult of personality is only possible with the dawn of mass media, as well as the modern ideas surrounding propaganda. In short, as this slide says, cult of personality requires mass media plus propaganda. The result of this simple addition problem is an idealized and heroic public image. For example, look at this poster. Here, Stalin is being depicted as a gentle, grandfatherly figure. He's holding the child in his arms. The child has flowers. The child is blonde-haired and blue-eyed. Essentially, Stalin is looked at as the wonderful grandfather who is protecting and looking out for this child. Here are a couple of other examples of the cult of personality under Stalin. But the cult of personality alone was not enough to create a true totalitarian state within the Soviet Union. Another key element of that state is going to be terror. Stalin's totalitarian state will rely on terror to prevent revolution or even dissent within his nation. Anyone who objected to Stalin or his policies was seen as an enemy, and enemies were to be eliminated. But they weren't just killed. They were erased from history. Take this photo above. It was taken in the early 1930s. Now, let's look at this same photo a few years later. Notice anything missing? But it wasn't just this one man who vanished. During the 1930s, Stalin created long lists of enemies of the Soviet state. Some actually were plotting his overthrow. Most, however, were simply victims of Stalin's paranoia. Anyone thought to be too popular with the people or too powerful with the army could be accused of treason, put on trial, and executed. To show how far these purges went, some of these people accused of treason were actually old revolutionaries, old friends of Stalin, people who had fought with Lenin in the revolution of 1917. Others were members of the army, or intellectuals from the Soviet Union's universities. Still others were simply ordinary citizens who got caught up in the paranoia of Stalin's totalitarian state. In all, when the bodies were counted, there were possibly 8 million dead from these purges from 1936 through 1938. Millions more were sent to Siberian labor camps. In conclusion, I hope you're seeing some similarities between the Soviet Union and the world of 1984. But while the Soviet Union may have been one inspiration for Orwell's dystopia, it was not the only one. The post-World War II world also provided numerous examples of what Orwell feared might happen in our modern society. We'll cover that in some future lectures.